When you think of helicopters being used in warfare, the Second World War isn't the first thing that comes to mind. Widespread use of helicopters in combat wasn't seen until the Korean War, and even then, most people probably think of Vietnam and the images of Hueys flying en masse over the dense jungles of the region. For the most part, World War II saw advances in the area of aviation, particularly with the German military. So it may be less surprising to know that German forces actually did utilise helicopters during the war. In today's video, we look at the use of helicopters during World War II. If you enjoy this video and want to see more, hit that subscribe button. It's free and really helps the channel reach more history lovers like you. 1907 would see the first helicopter take flight in France as a result of a painstaking trial and error by two brothers. Fast forward 3 decades, and in 1936, the Germans entered the helicopter race with the Focke-Wulf FW61. Based on an aircraft fuselage, the FW61 would feature 2 large rotors mounted either side of the fuselage. The engine also had a traditional propeller, like the aircraft of its day, to cool the engines at low speeds. Only 2 of these would be built, and their use during the war a few years later is not known, as neither of the prototypes survived. After this, a new company was created known as Fokker Arch-Gelis, and in 1940, its FA223 Dragon would see the first successful flight. An impressive 40 feet in length, and again featuring 2 large 3-bladed rotors, the FA223 featured a fully enclosed cabin for the 2 crew members. It had a top speed of 180 kilometers or 110 miles an hour, and an altitude of 7,000 kilometers or 23,000 feet. The main use of the Dragon was for transportation, and it had the ability to carry loads up to 1,000 kilograms or 2,200 pounds. It was an impressive aircraft with obvious uses for the war effort. After a number of prototypes, the Dragon was ordered into production. Unfortunately, only about 20 working helicopters were built during the war, due to the Allied bombing of its manufacturing centres. But some of the 223s would see use other than transport needs. In 1945, the Dragon would be utilised for artillery spotting in Austria against the fast approaching Allies. Post-war, some surviving assets were turned over to the British and the US for testing. Another interesting German design was the Flettner FL-282. This one-man aircraft first took to the sky in 1941, and unlike the 2 previous designs, it featured a single rotor above the fuselage, much closer in design to modern helicopters. The Kriegsmarine took particular interest in its design, and once production was approved, it would be used to ferry items between ships. Similar to the fate of the Dragon, the large order of 1,000 units would only see around 25 being built, due again to heavy Allied bombing. A slightly different version was created which allowed for an additional seat, meaning it could now be used for artillery spotting. This is something the 282 would do in the last stages of the war, but not many would survive, as they were sitting ducks for anti-aircraft and Allied fighters. The last German example we'll look at wasn't actually a helicopter. The Fokker Arch-Gelis FA330 was a rotor wing kite. It took its first flight in 1942 and again featured a single large 3-bladed rotor. But unlike the other versions, the 330 didn't have enough power to lift itself off the ground. It was designed specifically for use by the Kriegsmarine, particularly for U-boats. The aircraft was stored within the submarine and brought to the deck once it surfaced. A 2-man team could put the lightweight aircraft together, as it featured no traditional fuselage. The single pilot would climb aboard, and with the rotors spinning and the U-boat moving, the airflow generated would guide the 330 into the sky, much like a kite or a parasail. The aircraft would be tethered to the boat and reach a height of around 120 meters or nearly 400 feet. This allowed the pilot to see into the distance and allowed for guidance to the U-boat to sight Allied shipping convoys. Around 200 of these would be built during the war, and it would see use by at least a handful of U-boats, a very impressive and ingenious design by the German military. The last example in this video is actually a US design. The Sikorsky R4 was designed by Igor Sikorsky, a Russian who immigrated to the United States before the war. Its first flight would be in 1942 and feature a modern design of a large main rotor and a smaller tail rotor for stability. The R4 had an enclosed cabin for the 2 crew members and a maximum speed of 120 kilometers or 75 miles an hour. Its range was also decent at around 210 kilometers or 130 miles. Only around 130 of these helicopters were built, but the limited number did see use during the war. Most of the flights took place in the Far East, with rescue missions sent out to bring back downed pilots, as well as ferrying supplies and equipment between ships and islands in the South Pacific. The R4 would feature as a blueprint to future US designs, which quickly came around at least a decade later during the Korean War. This was just a handful of designs. There were also helicopters used, or tested at least, in some capacity by the United Kingdom, Japan, and the Soviet Union. But definitely an interesting topic that seems to be rarely covered by the history books. What are your thoughts on the helicopters of World War II? Did you know that helicopters were used during the war? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section down below. As always guys, thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that subscribe button if you want to expand your knowledge and join the growing Premier History community.